and Communities at Duke Divinity School. And in addition to that, I'm ordained in the United Methodist tradition. I served in pastoral ministry for just over a decade and have a true love and also concern for clergy that I know you share as well. Many of you who are engaged in lifelong learning or in other types of ministry. We've already done a little bit in terms of getting to know each other, but I'd like to do just one additional piece. In the chat, I have posted a link, and that link will take you to a place where I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. And as we get started in today's presentation, I'd love for it to be a conversation, a little bit more kind of interactive than just kind of lecture style. So I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you. And the first question is, why does lifelong learning matter to clergy or pastors? Started to have a few items come in here. Let me just, there we go. All right, so why does lifelong learning matter to clergy or pastors? Because the tools keep changing, because of growth and relevancy, for authenticity, to keep current. In some contexts, it is a requirement for growth and personal enrichment, for sustaining ministry. And then it seems like that a few of you have this idea of effectiveness as well. One of the things that we know about clergy in particular is that sometimes when they get to dry points in their ministry, their first call isn't always to the pastoral counselor, but instead, in some cases, it might be to the local seminary to sign up for a continuing education course or a Doctor of Ministry program. So we know for sure that lifelong learning is incredibly important to pastors, and obviously it matters. Now let me ask another question. I'm curious, how does your work impact clergy or pastors? So looking there at the link that I've already sent out, your options should now have changed. So how does your work impact clergy or pastors? I love this as we're watching to see how your work impacts clergy. Interesting that you note that the -- way your work impacts clergy or pastors is in terms of providing support to them, but you're also connecting them. You're providing peer learning, updating kind of research opportunities. You're teaching future clergy. You're partnering together in ministry. You're giving them new skills and ongoing training. You're exciting them for the work that lays ahead. You're giving them skills and also a safe place to process information. So these are some of the ways that not only clergy are impacted by your work, but also some of the ways that it really matters. And I want to call upon this idea of support as one of the primary methods that truly is important for the work, the shared ministry that we have in caring for clergy. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Caring for Clergy research initiative that the Duke Endowment has so graciously funded. Some of you are aware that the Duke Endowment has been a long supporter of, in particular, the health and well-being of clergy across North Carolina. In fact, they funded a longitudinal study of clergy well-being within the United Methodist tradition over the past 12 years. So any question that you've got about clergy well-being, whether it be from Sabbath practices to heart rate variability to body mass index, I mean, we've tracked all kinds of different components that truly relate to the physical health of clergy. But one of the things that we've become aware of in more recent time is that while we can tell you a lot about the individual health and well-being of a clergy person, we know relatively less about the support network that surrounds that clergy person. So how is that clergy person cared for? The way that I have talked with some individuals about this is in thinking about in the book of Exodus, Moses is leading the children of Israel in battle, arms raised, and then he becomes weary. His arms begin to drift downward, and Aaron and Hur come alongside him to support and sustain his arms. That's one example within a biblical narrative of a leader experiencing support, but we can think about it in so many different ways. So for instance, in the New Testament, we might think of the story of Mary and Martha. Mary was there at the feet of Jesus and is complimented for being there, but Martha has an incredibly important role to play because she's caring for the needs of Jesus during that particular moment. Well, much like Aaron and Hur, or perhaps like Martha, you all care for clergy in some way, shape, or form. And we are interested in knowing more about what it is that you do, about how it is you are supporting the clergy that are in your care. So while the Duke Endowment has kind of said to us, like, we know a ton about the individual health and well-being of clergy. We know a lot about Moses. What we know relatively less about are Aaron and Hur, or to put another way, about Martha. So what we've designed is a national study that will begin to actually be launched next week, and will look at these particular individuals across a number of different categories. We are interested in knowing about the struggles you face, the areas of excitement that you have, the scalable solutions that are available that need to be noted. And we've designed this in such a way that we have called it the Caring for Clergy Field Guide. So I'm going to just, over the next few moments, take you through each of those terms to give you a bit of an imagination behind this particular study. And then we'll have a time for conversation after I'm done. So please feel free to take notes or to engage in kind of keeping those questions at the forefront. If there are any questions you have at the end of the presentation, I'd be more than happy to field those with you. So the first term that is really important here is clergy, or pastor, depending on the tradition. And if any group knows this, it is you, that there are a lot of different ways that we can define what constitutes a clergy person. So we can think about it based upon perhaps education status or ordination. We can think about place of service. We could think about clergy in terms of active or retired. There are a lot of different ways we can think about what constitutes a clergy person. And in fact, we did a just kind of a thought analysis in our office on a whiteboard, and this is the spectrum that we came up with, all the way from those that are engaged in congregational ministry to those that are not engaged in congregational ministry. And I would be one of those. So I'm ordained, as I mentioned, in the United Methodist tradition, but I'm not currently serving in a local pastoral appointment. Well, for the purpose of this particular project, what we're really interested in is the support network that is surrounding clergy that are in some way, shape, or form connected to a local congregation. So it could be in a bivocational or even part-time kind of status, but what we're interested in are who are the Aarons and the Hurs, or perhaps we could think about it in terms of Martha. Who are those that are supporting and sustaining pastors in their current placement, especially those, and particularly for the purpose of this project, those that are engaged in some form of congregational ministry. One thing I'll just mention here briefly is that while the support network we anticipate is more formalized for those who are engaged in a full-time appointment, what we anticipate is that for those that are in bivocational categories, that there are less formal opportunities that are available for them. So we're really interested not just in the support network that's surrounding those pastors or clergy that are engaged in a full-time way, but also in a bivocational way as well. The second term that's important for us to define here is, what do we mean by caring? And there's a lot of different ways that clergy are cared for. In fact, we believe that some of the most effective and important ways that clergy are cared for are in very specific and localized mechanisms. So just as an example, when I first arrived at my first congregational appointment as a pastor, I remember there was a family that came and brought a meal to me as I was unloading the moving truck, and they helped me to unload those boxes. throughout the first 6 months of my ministry, it wasn't what the denomination did, it was what that family did that really set me off in a wonderful kind of trajectory. But the problem is that that was very localized in terms of the experience to both me and also to my congregation. So for the purpose of this particular study, we are interested in what are those lever points? What are the avenues of caring that cross many different clergy or perhaps many different congregations? And the way that we've thought about this is at least in these categories. So we think that denominations, and here you can read denomination perhaps as another term for networks or associations, perhaps really when we think about non-denominational congregations and their pastors as well. But basically, there are networks and associations, whether they be denominationally affiliated or not, that are really important in terms of caring for clergy. We also think that there are some funders that are important here as well. Some of you have mentioned that you're involved in some grants, perhaps from Lilly Endowment, Thriving in Ministry being one of those. So we know that there are funders like Lilly Endowment, the Duke Endowment, Murdoch Charitable Trust, and so many others that are important to this particular constellation. We think that there are pension, benefits, and insurance officers, whether those be associated with a denomination or not. So just as an example, Brotherhood Mutual is the second largest insurer of clergy nationally. They would be in this particular category as well, as, for instance, in my own tradition of the United Methodist Church, West Path Benefits and Investments, which is our denominational carrier for our pension program, and also in some cases for health benefits as well. We think that there are frontline providers, and for us, this is an umbrella term. So it represents everything from those that are involved in a marriage and family therapist, the spiritual director, the coach, the retreat center provider. We could go on and on, but there are frontline providers who interact with many different clergy across many different congregations. And then finally, and part of the reason why we are gathered today is because we believe that continuing education is an incredibly important role for clergy. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes when clergy are getting to that dry point in their ministry, their first call is not necessarily to the pastoral counselor or to their spiritual director. Sometimes what they do is they sign up for a Doctor of Ministry program or a certificate program that many of you might lead. So these are some of the avenues of caring that we find are incredibly important. Just a couple of notes here. First is that while these are certainly distinct categories on this slide, we don't mean to suggest that these are distinct categories in a global sense. These are not mutually exclusive. So I'll just kind of note, because I know we've got some folks from the Presbyterian Church USA on the call. The Board of Pensions for the PCUSA is a denominationally affiliated pension board, but they also provide some continuing education services and contract with some frontline providers as well. They provide some source of funding and also maybe are a sub-grant in some cases, like when Lilly goes about and doing things such as economic challenges facing pastoral leaders. They have chosen, Lilly Endowment that is, to work with the denominational pension boards in many cases. So these are not meant to be mutually exclusive categories, but instead just some frameworks that help us to get our arms around how we might think of Aaron, her, or Martha in that particular analogy. The second thing that I want to mention here is that in many cases, these particular groups are siloed, either by their own specific subsector or perhaps by their denominational or theological tradition. So in my case of the United Methodist Church, there are mechanisms that are involved for cross-sector collaboration within our denomination but we're not necessarily in most direct conversation across the board with the UCC or with the Southern Baptist or other groups as well. And then also for the specific subsector. So as an example, the PCUSA Board of Pensions is a member of the Church Benefits Association. Well, they have a group that is meeting regularly, is in conversation, but they're not always in direct conversation with, let's say, the frontline providers. You all represent one part of this constellation as far as continuing education providers. So what would it be like if we were able to put these different voices in greater conversation together to get perspective about how clergy are being supported in a long-term way? So these are some of the ways that we define what constitutes caring, or at least the avenues that we anticipate are important. But the final term here that is important for us is, what do we mean by a field guide? Now, we are building off of a part of the genre of literature that you might think of, such as Birds of the Pacific Northwest, or any of those types of field guides that basically help a reader understand his or her environment. So what we are about to launch out on is a national study of these different types of individuals that we've just defined to better understand who they are and what they're doing. So for us, a field guide has at least these 4 components. The first is we want to define the field. So who's out there? And then second, what are the major trends in the field? So what is going on? What's the activity that is taking place? The third piece for us is to provide some illustrative case studies. So in addition to the graphs, the facts, the figures that we certainly want to produce, we also want to tell a story that might help people to better understand what's happening, that maybe there's an innovative solution out there that we all would benefit from knowing about, or maybe there's a struggle that someone in this particular area is having. Well, we want to know what that is. And in so doing, then we can provide some illustrative case studies that actually help to illustrate what is taking place within the field. And then the final piece for us that's really important is to provide a framework for advancing practice. So what we're trying to think about here is, no matter where you are in this particular field, how do you take your next best step forward? And all of this, what we hope that you hear is, it's not enough for us to just do a peer-reviewed academic study. Those are certainly things that we want to do, but that's not enough for us. We actually want to create a tool that will help you in your work, and eventually helping then clergy in the process. So our process for the past 6 or 8 months has been to try to define who is in this particular field. And thus far, we have identified more than 1,000 different individuals or organizations across the United States primarily, and a few in Canada as well. Obviously, just for the purpose of our study, we're concentrating on North America with a particular emphasis on the United States, but certainly we're interested across North America to understand what's happening. What would it be like if these different groups got together? What would it be like if they began to learn from each other about their similar struggles or their pain points? And I'll just give you a quick example. So a few weeks ago, I was on a call with Westpath Benefits and Investment, which is the United Methodist Board of Health and Pension Benefits. And they were talking about a new program that they have that they've designed, where clergy can go out and seek counseling services, and then just they can submit almost like for insurance purposes, and they can receive reimbursement. Well, there was a gentleman who was on the call, and he began to kind of question this because he's from North Dakota. And so he said to the presenter, he said, "I love this idea, but," he said, "I just need you to know there are only 2 providers in all of North or South Dakota that accept this form of insurance. So here, while you think you're providing this great benefit, my clergy don't have access." What would it be like, and this is the place where I'll leave you and we'll turn towards any questions that you might have, but what would it be like if these different groups were in closer conversation, had an awareness of what was going on? How might it change the way that funders think about their funding if they better understood the needs of the providers that were actually facilitating the services? What would it be like if they understood, for continuing education purposes, what your struggles were, or where you were just so excited about a particular model that was effective in some way, shape, or form? So that's a little bit about our Caring for Clergy field guide. As I mentioned, we are going to be fielding this beginning next week, and we wanted to invite you all as a select group really to consider to partner with us in this particular effort. We hope that you will take our survey so that we can then provide the results back to you. We've been in conversation with some organizations that have actually seen this particular research agenda as being helpful in terms of sketching out their next 5 or 10 years because they would better understand the state of the field and also better understand their particular place in it. So that ends my formal presentation. I know we've got a few questions that you all might have, and I'd be more than happy to field any of those that you have.
Okay, well, thank you, Thad. Folks, you're welcome to go back into gallery mode. The button is up there in the top right corner. Just move your mouse up there. You'll see the button that says view, and then go into gallery mode so that we can all see each other. And we're probably a small enough group that you can just open your mic and ask questions, but I'd invite you to do that now.
I have a quick question regarding location. So I know that you were mentioning that you're most interested those in the United States, largely North America. Is that where the continuing education occurs? I would imagine most of us are doing it online in some capacity. I'm in a unique situation whereby I run my organization from abroad, but my students are from 23, 30 different countries, most of them being North American based, most of them having theological education occurring in many of the denominations mentioned here. So how would you define where someone's based if they're online, kind of essentially running it from anywhere?
Oh boy, this is the question of the COVID-19 pandemic in many ways. Right now, my wife and I are actually working remotely, which is part of the reason why my internet connection wasn't as stable as I would have hoped. So this is the particular uniqueness of our, and also opportunity of our particular state. And I would actually say this is, when we talk about what are the frontiers, what are the new opportunities that are out there, this is one of them. And so I am particularly interested in understanding the changing complexities of the continuing education space. And I think that you've highlighted one of those in particular, that the geophysical location of an individual might not actually be within the confines of a traditional model. Well, this is going to be something that would be really helpful for those that are thinking about funding continuing education opportunities and also the impact that they make beyond just a specific geographic region to include other areas as well. So we are concentrated right now just in the same way that we've kind of tried to think about how do we define what a clergy person is. There's a lot of different ways we could think about that. We've tried to kind of hone that in towards the support network that is surrounding those in a congregational placement. And in the same way, we've tried to think about, just as a starting point, what's happening within North America and particularly the United States. But that is a starting point, I would say, not necessarily an ending point. We would love to learn about international opportunities and indeed our brothers and sisters who are in transnational context is something we're really interested in. So thank you so much, Lindsay. Hopefully, does that answer your question? Great, thank you. Anyone else have a question or comment that you'd like to make?
I wanted to point out Helen Blyer, who is, her photo's not up right now, but she's the researcher that did our alum study for mapping the landscape of lifelong learning. And she and an assistant are finishing collating the data. And I told you I would introduce the two of you. So this is your first introduction, and I will follow up with an email. She is very willing to share some of her data and continue in the conversation with you. And we are delighted to be able to support it. And those of you who are in this call that have responded to that survey, we're sharing. We like to share well with others. We also do have members who are not on this call from Ireland, the Republic, and Northern Ireland, and New Zealand. So we've got some other, if you want some additional information.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And just to follow up on that, one of the things that we want you to know from just the outset is that we actually think the only way that this particular project is successful is that if we who are stewarding it initially hold it very lightly. So this is not a Duke thing. This is not, this is not something just about me. What we intend to do is to take the aggregated data and make that publicly available. And also we're interested in learning. As you mentioned, Sarah, we know that there is particular work that your group has already done. So we want to think about how can we highlight, how can we advance and build upon the good work that you all have already done. We see this as a partnership, and we know that that's the way that it would be most effective long-term for the benefit, not just of us, but ultimately for the clergy that we serve. Karen, I think you might have had a hand raised a minute ago.
Yes, Thad, it sounds like the lion's share of what you're planning on this first phase is really descriptive of what's happening and who's doing what through these different avenues, what the gaps or pain points are. Could you say a little bit more about your plans to evaluate the effectiveness of the different strategies that people are taking and the impact we're actually have, like, are we actually caring for clergy well? That's a question I'd like to know.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Erica. And it's such a great question. So what we feel like we need to do in terms of an exploratory study, this is something that is so big and ambitious that it keeps me up at night, and I worry about how we're going to pull it all off. But I actually was at a coffee shop earlier today and saw a slogan on the wall that said, if your dreams aren't scaring you, then they're too small. So we see this as an opportunity to do something that we hope would truly be a seminal resource that you could draw on. And the first piece of an exploratory study certainly is to describe the landscape. So just as you think about the field guide for birds of the Pacific Northwest, you have to have a really good understanding of who's out there. What does that bird look like? How do I know it when I see it? So certainly there is some descriptive elements, but we actually see this as a longitudinal project. So the IRB that we established, we can ask these questions for the next 30 years. We want to see how the field is moving and evolving with time. What is the form and shape that it takes? And one of those areas that we're really interested in terms of long-term kind of item is certainly the effectiveness. So what we've done is we've convened both a practitioner advisory board that is representative of some of the kind of key institutional leaders across the different categories that I mentioned earlier. And we've also convened a group of 9 of the leading scholars that deal in the topic of clergy well-being or clergy effectiveness, those kinds of things that are advising us on this particular project. So what I'm getting at, and it's a long way to answer your very direct question, is that effectiveness is something that is incredibly interesting to us. So just as a quick example, Rob Webb from the Duke Endowment is serving as one of the funders on our particular, on our advisory board. And he has noted that whether it be in terms of clergy counseling or even a retreat center, that there aren't always some minimum standards that are established or ways that we've defined what constitutes effectiveness. And this is an area that he wants us to move in, in the end, not just to describe the field, but also to help it become more effective. And also for us to be able to point out, this is not working well, or this area is really struggling, or, if you're going to be working with clergy, here's the good housekeeping seal of approval. Those are the kinds of things that we imagine. And that's in one particular area of a kind of effectiveness and the way we evaluate it. But here's another. We would love to do a follow-up study of a nationally representative random sample of clergy and to ask them some of the same questions that we ask you all. And then to say, how do these two things match up? Because it could be that we think we're providing this great benefit. So I mentioned earlier about the WestPath Benefits and Investment, having this wonderful new program for clergy. And it just so happens that the frontline providers, they can't accept the insurance because they get paid pennies on the dollar. And it's just not, it's not economically viable. So what would it be like to ask the clergy, well, how are we doing? And allow them to begin to shape some of the ways that we think about effectiveness as well. So to answer your question, yes, we are thinking about description right now, but also with an eye towards the effectiveness piece as well. Does that help, Erica?
Yes, excellent. Thank you. And that's exciting. It's exciting.
Wonderful. Thank you. Someone else have a comment or question that they'd like to engage?
How are you planning to distribute the survey?
It's a great question. Yeah, and so we've established a website for the study where you can find out some more information. There's a bunch of frequently asked questions and those kind of things. You also can see who's serving on the advisory board and see some endorsements that we've got from a number of different parties. I can say faithfully that there's a lot of conversations that are happening across these different areas because in some ways there have been, the COVID-19 has kind of reset a lot of our expectations. So there's been a number of groups that have been really interested in this particular project. What we are planning to do is to email those within that, you remember the map that I showed you previously? So we are going to be emailing those folks a direct link into the survey, but also we're going to be partnering with different groups like Alum, or as an example, there's a group called Full Strength Network, which is a group of providers of clergy pastoral counseling services across the United States. So it's a twofold method. One is just the basic awareness if somebody stumbles upon our work from their website. Second, we'll be emailing those that we become in direct contact. And then the third is to partner with different agencies that are representative of the key players that we think are really important. And on that point, Sarah, I'll just say that we see Alum as the key player, or at least one of the key players in the continuing education space. So part of the reason why we wanted to have the call today is to honor you, to make sure that you were aware of what is going on, and then also to invite you into the opportunity to take the survey as well. I know, Daryl, I think you've got a question as well.
Ed, thank you. I really appreciate your efforts and your energy for this. I'll say that I teach a class in ministerial ethics, and I use Prashad Bell's and Biassi's book that comes out of the longitudinal study on clergy health. So we use that to good effect, and I'm looking forward to having more tools or field guide. One of the things that I've noticed in, I'm teaching a class in bivocational ministry right now, is that the students of color have the most difficulty engaging online. And that's been consistent both in continuing ed as well as in our master's degree programs. And so I'm wondering, in a online survey, how do you avoid the data skewing white, affluent, and full-time? because those folks who are working partially funded positions bivocationally, those folks who are rural or are not in affluent areas, whose regular medium of communication is not online, and for persons of color and immigrant communities, how are you going to reach those pastors who, in fact, I think are in the most need of support as clergy?
This is such a wonderful question. Thank you very much, Daryl. And just to affirm both the spirit behind your question as well as the question itself. So one important clarification here, in the analogy of Moses, Aaron, and Hur, we're going to be, at least at this initial phase, surveying those that are the Aarons and Hurs, not the Moses. So we eventually would be very interested to survey clergy and to understand their particular needs. That gets right to the heart of the question that I think Erica had asked previously. But the question is, how are we specifically engaging with communities of color, with minority communities? And we might also think about folks such as that are serving under-resourced groups like those that are in bivocational ministry, or perhaps women in ministry as another category as well. So what we've tried to do is to be very strategic in the way that we have first and foremost established our advisory board to be diverse in terms of theological tradition, as well as race and denominational affiliation. And so that's the first way that we want to be very sensitive in terms of those that are actually shaping what the questions are. Then second, we have partnered with some of the members of our advisory board as well as other groups to ensure that we are specifically inviting into this particular study those that are within minority populations or those that don't have immediate access in the ways that you've described. So just as an example, we will be partnering, we hope, with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference as one kind of group that is, we know, very important. We just became aware of another group that meets out of the Pacific Northwest, the largest gathering of African-American clergy that exists within the United States on an annual basis. So we are very interested in ensuring that the voices are representative across many different criteria. Then also, and this kind of leads to another point about the particular survey that's important to note. We have highlighted the survey because that's our first kind of entree into this particular conversation, but we see it actually as a mixed methods study, and we will be hosting a number of focus groups as well as conversations across many different criterion that would help for us to provide, here's what we're hearing out of the data. You tell us, like, where does that not work for you? Or what are we missing? What have we not heard from? So those listening sessions, those focus groups are going to be incredibly important for us moving forward. Hopefully that helps answer the question, Daryl.
So there's a question in the chat from Karen. She's got noise in the background, so I will read that aloud so that it's captured in the recording. Karen writes, I have a couple of wonderings. Will doing this research at this stage of the pandemic indicate a greater than typical need? I was also wondering about bivocational leaders also, thanks, Daryl. And I'm also wondering about any account of needs across ages and stages of vocation.
This is wonderful. Really, I'm just so grateful for this particular question. And we know that this is a unique time in the kind of place where we are in the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic. And we actually see it as a really kind of strategic time, where, as I mentioned earlier, things are being reset, and it offers us an opportunity to begin engaging in some meaningful conversations. Just as an example of the way that we think about the survey, there's a question on the survey that asks about, have you engaged in a formal process of listening to or kind of surveying the clergy that you serve in the past 12 months during the pandemic? We actually, I mean, if folks haven't been listening to the clergy that have been totally dislocated from their pulpits and their flocks over the past year, then that might tell us something about the state of the field, about how responsive we are. So we've got some questions on the survey that specifically are trying to get at, what's new during the pandemic, but also what's tried and true. What are you finding to be effective or scalable? We actually see those as kind of two sides of the same coin. So thanks so much for that. The other piece that I'd mentioned previously is that we intended for this to be a longitudinal project. So while this is the first iteration, we would love to engage in finding some of those questions on the survey that really speak to the heart of this particular movement of caring for clergy, and to follow those over time so we're able to see and perhaps even demonstrate to funders, let's say, how is the field changing? What are the areas of opportunity that are available to us as well? And then finally, just to affirm the needs that are present for bivocational folks, I actually see this as one of the keystones of our effort, because we know that ministry is changing rapidly, that the traditional models of education are no longer sufficient. Perhaps maybe the Master of Divinity is not the primary mode by which the clergy in the future will be trained, and they might be in fact trained through some continuing education opportunities that you and your colleagues offer. Well, if that's the case, then we would love to be able to support that and also to define it in terms of its empirical validity as well. So this is one of the areas where we're hoping to provide some perspective for you all as well.
I have a question. You had said that,
Yeah.
that coming out of the program, there might be opportunities to gather together the denominational officials and the funders and the frontline providers and continue education and sort of help us talk to each other. But you didn't say any more about what that might look like. I wonder if you'd like to just sort of expand on that a little bit. What's your dream?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we have been dreaming up is something that we call the Common Table Collaborative. And in fact, I'll just present here the logo. We actually just designed this. This is something that we have been kind of playing around with for the past year. We want to, as we are surveying this particular group, we also, and it's a very strategic move, we want to build out the community that would offer a platform for that very conversation to occur. We think that that has a few different types of iterations. So we certainly feel that there is an online component, but we also would envision perhaps an in-person gathering where, for instance, as we're called the Common Table Collaborative, we want to be thoughtful about the ways that even the seating is done. So instead of lecture hall, we're seated around tables. And perhaps, you have some conversation starters and a few presentations from some leading experts, but where we see the actual work being done at the tables, where each of us have kind of a seat. So you'll notice that in the logo that is here, there is a dot that is not filled in. This is intentional. It's designed to be an open seat around a table where you're invited to come and to participate in. This particular effort of the Common Table Collaborative, at least thus far, is a partnership that is and has been emerging through our various partners with the Duke Clergy Health Initiative, the Ormond Center, which I represent at Duke Divinity School, Azusa Pacific. Some of you might know Chris Adams. He's been involved heavily with this. Dave Higgle from the Wesleyan Church and Indiana Wesleyan University has also been one of the key players here. So what we've done during the pandemic is we've been gathering on a monthly basis to hear from a speaker and then to send people into breakout rooms for conversation. Those conversations are the most important part of the work we do. So we have hosted, and in fact, I'd be more than happy to pass along a link to Sarah that would offer opportunity for you all to engage with some of the content that we have done thus far. But just as an example, we had Dave Wang from Biola University come and talk to us about trauma-informed care. With the numbers of individuals that are survivors of trauma, one of the things he was saying is, what if you looked at clergy, not just as clergy, but as survivors of trauma? How might that impact the way that you teach them? You provide continuing education services. We had Mark Chaves come and give a presentation on the latest wave of the National Congregation Study. So anyway, you get the idea. We're trying to build out a mechanism and a platform for collaboration to take place while we're also doing the research as well. Does that help, Stephen?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Any other comments or questions that you all might have?
I'm just grateful for
Yes,
I'm just grateful for the fact that the care and well-being of clergy is being thought of in a comprehensive sense. I mean, the data that are starting to come out now in terms of anticipated early retirement and departure rates, attrition from congregational work, particularly due to the pandemic, they're well, let's just say the numbers are good for the students who are going to be graduating the next couple of years, but it's kind of terrifying. And what I am concerned about is the lingering trauma and vocational disappointment of the people who are either on the verge of leaving or choosing to leave. And any kind of comprehensive effort that has their well-being as its North Star is, I think, a really important effort.
Thank you so much, Helen, for the affirmation. Yeah, this is, we've tried to think about it in at least as comprehensive as a way that we can imagine right now. And what we, one of the things why I like one of the reasons why I like the analogy from the Exodus account is that it wasn't just Aaron, but it was Aaron and her, that there were multiple individuals that were involved in supporting and sustaining the leader in that particular moment. And we know that none of us alone can be fully either responsible for or totally effective in our work unless we're kind of joined by others in this particular effort. Now, the way I think about that theologically would be in terms of the body of Christ, the way that Paul talks about this particular topic, that we each have a certain role, and all of that, when combined together, is extraordinarily important. It creates a holistic opportunity to offer care and support in ways that we hope are effective. And to the point earlier about closer conversation, I mean, if we could collaborate with others across denominational or theological tradition or even sector, we might become more effective in our own work. We might learn something that, let's say, that the Nazarenes are doing that is working so well, that's having extraordinary impact. We might learn something that the folks in the PCUSA are doing where they're finding like, hey, just avoid this, like don't try this again. So that holistic approach certainly has been part of our overall. Lindsay, I think you might have another question.
Yeah, so when you brought up the trauma-informed care, it reminded me, so at the School of Global Citizenry, we have 2 instructors, one of whom was a seminary adjunct and moved to the School of Global Citizenry to begin hosting with a different, kind of a different bent on their work. And then the other is a faith-based nonprofit, one of them handling the training of movement chaplains. So Black Lives Matter, the trauma that's coming from the day and age which we live in, and continued systemic racism in today's society. And then the other dealing with just what you were mentioning, the trauma-informed care, but those people who are now turning around and using that trauma they've been through to care for others. These are two of our largest courses. So in a given year, 700 to 800 students are coming through those courses. And the large majority of them either in seminary or having graduated from seminary, but not part necessarily of an established kind of brick and mortar congregation. I don't know if that would be of interest to you, but it seems to be a growing demographic. Like I said, this course went, it was the first time it was offered at the School of Global Citizenry, it was large at best, but the next time that it was offered in unison with the pandemic, it was enormous, to the point that we had to hire some folks to continue to manage all of it with us. So it definitely seems to be a growing demographic of folks who maybe on the periphery are what you would call clergy, but it seems to be the largest demographic, at least in our community. I don't know if that would be of interest to you, Thad, but those instructors, I definitely can make a connection. They seem to be in the same realms, the Duke Endowment, the Lilly Endowment, they're in those realms already. But I'm not sure that people know quite how large their impact seems to be with those who they're training. So it seems to be the fastest growing demographic for us, perhaps not for everyone else. But if that would be valuable to your research, I could definitely make a connection there to try to have you learn from them directly about what they're seeing, because they've gone from one course a year to now 4 or 5 offerings a year, because just the desire for that knowledge seems to be growing, both the trauma informed and also the protest chaplaincy.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay, especially for the ministry that you provide to this growing population. And this is one of the areas we're certainly interested in. We want to know, how is pastoral ministry changing, which has profound implications for theological education, as an example, or continuing education, or the ways that we think about certification. So yes, we would love to learn from you. And also, I want you to know too, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, amongst a number of academics who are on the call, as I mentioned earlier, we hope to start a conversation, but we don't see ourselves as the finisher of the conversation. We know that there are more opportunities for inquiry than we're going to be able to offer. So one of the things that I'd love to suggest, Lindsay, is, this is a perfect example of a way, let's say, in the field guide, for there to be part of our conclusion to talk about the ways that pastoral ministry is changing dramatically, and perhaps to call upon those that are in the academy to do additional research, to provide, maybe if we can start asking the right questions, then we can get the right data to actually to have that perspective we need to be able to do the work that we do on a daily basis. So thanks so much for that. And yes, we are very interested. We'd love to follow up.
Well, and Helen has posted some questions, and there's been some comments about receptivity on the part of congregational leaders to things that smack even of self-care, as in pastors need it, but the congregations think they don't. So that's another facet of the trauma that is out there. But the other aspect is, my colleague Israel Galindo shared a report recently that 4,500 congregations at least have closed during the pandemic. And that's more than have been started. So that's another level of trauma for all the stakeholders in this survey who are dealing with, and part of the congregational leaders. And that element, be curious, that's going to show up somewhere in the study as well.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the things that in conversations I've had with the National Association for Christian Conference and Camps, the Conference and Camp kind of association, the past year has been devastating to their underlying business model because they had to shut down all their summer camps and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that I said to them is that in order for there to be a long-term sustained program that they're going to be able to offer might in some ways be impacted, let's say, by the vitality of local congregations that send kids to summer camp, as an example. And the healthier that pastor of that congregation is, the more effective that congregation is, that then calls new people into ministry, that offers, anyway, you get the idea that we all kind of have a stake in this in a way that does provide, I believe, a comprehensive approach that helps us all do our jobs in a better way. The other piece I wanted to note quickly about self-care. This is so important. And one of the areas of inquiry that we have in the survey is noting, so where's the resistance? So in your continuing ed kind of program, is there resistance? Where's it coming from? What's that resistance about? Or let's say, the denominational folks that are on the call. Are you gaining traction around your particular programs or not? If not, why? We'd love to know that because it might be helpful for us just to name it. I got a great kind of story I heard recently from Dave Higgle, who I mentioned earlier. And it's this precise kind of area. He mentioned about how the denomination was so interested in church planting and all these other things, but did not want to engage the topic of caring for clergy. So what would it mean to create a greater movement there? So just an affirmation of this whole notion of self-care and the resistance that often does come as a result. I think Kathy's got her hand raised.
I just wanted to make a comment about the self-care issue. At PDA, of course, we respond to disasters, but in COVID, we've just been responding to the pandemic, and we've done 80 to 90 programs in resilience, reached 800 or so folks within PCUSA and beyond that have self-care as a component, but our titles typically focus more on resilience, on support of clergy. We have a retreat for resilience and renewal. So we've had a lot of good success with it, and the self-care is embedded, but it's, for whatever reason, not really in our title. When we talk about resilience, when we talk about building their own resilience to serve others, that seems to overcome at least some of that resistance. And happy to share more information about our programs. That's helpful to anyone.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, so this is a perfect example, Kathy. I've heard recently about there's a lady in New Mexico who has a program where she trains counselors on how to counsel clergy, because she's a licensed therapist and she has found that the way that she counsels individuals in general versus the way she counsels clergy is not effective. She's got this scalable model, and the only thing that she's missing is funding. That she's got a program where she can help counselors better understand how to counsel. The program that you just highlighted for us is another example. I've talked to a guy out of the Pacific Northwest. He's got a model where he sends clergy couples on bike retreats. I mean, all kinds of just creative things that you never would really think about, but that are having tremendous impact. And so insofar as we can be helpful in sharing stories of effectiveness or of heartache that you've experienced, we certainly want to do that. We want to highlight and to lift up the work that you're doing, and also to affirm you in it as well. And I know I see Daryl has asked this great question about the label self-care. So there's a couple of areas of inquiry that we've got in terms of broad kind of categories that our advisory boards have helped to define. The first is the organization of the field. They want to know, how is the field organized? Who's in it? The second is the activity that is taking place in the field. So what's happening? What can we learn from great work that Kathy and others have been doing? And then the third piece is the conceptualization. How do we conceptualize the field? Because one of the areas that we have become really aware of is that just because we're using the same terms doesn't mean that we're often operating under the same definition. Here's a great example. The Duke Clergy Health Initiative has an understanding of what constitutes clergy well-being. That may or may not be the same as Matt Bloom's work out of Notre Dame, or Westpath Benefits and Investment. So if we could just better understand how people are understanding their work and what constitutes care for clergy, what constitutes self-care, those kinds of things, we might be a lot further along in terms of just having a glossary of what we mean when we use these terms, so that we're not talking past each other, but we're actually able to engage in conversation with each other in a more effective way.
Stephen, did you have a question?
There it goes. Sorry, I was pushing the unmute button and it didn't happen. One of the things I think we need to be cautious of around self-care is that it's very easy to blame the victim, and we individualize it. We talk about clergy that don't take care of themselves, or clergy who are in trouble, or clergy who don't take care of themselves, clergy who are struggling with depression or burnout are the ones who did bad things and they weren't good clergy. And there's a moral cast we put to that. I think we also need to be aware of the water that clergy are swimming in. And this is hitting me between the eyes right now when I'm working with people preparing for retirement. The folks that I'm working with are depressed because on their watch, the church has shrunk. On their watch, the church is half of what it was when they went into this job, and they feel responsible. And then they feel like if they just take the next phone call, if they just skip the next choir practice so they can go and do the next thing, if they could just preach a better sermon then. And so we're starting to look at ways to address the systemic anxiety, depression, trauma that clergy are living within, and try to take away that moral judgment that clergy who are sad or bad, because that ain't necessarily so.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is so important, Stephen. I mean, this is the as you mentioned, not blaming the victim, but actually kind of providing a sense of hope and expectation and opportunity. We certainly want to be critical in our analysis of the field, to be able to eventually, as Erica mentioned earlier, to be able to say, look, this plane just won't fly if you're going to build it with these pieces. But by the same token, we actually see ourselves as hopefully trying to start a movement. And we know that in order to do that well, we need to paint a vision of a preferred future. So I mentioned earlier about the frameworks that advance practice. So the idea behind this whole idea of a field guide, as we've thought about it, is not just simply to be descriptive or even critical on its own of the field, but instead to say to the field, here's how you take your next best step forward. And not just in a prescriptive way, not in a like you have to do X, Y, and Z way, but to say like, here's what we found to be effective, or here's the questions that you need to be asking. Because if you don't ask these questions, maybe in your own particular theological tradition and coming up with the solutions that are right for your particular context, then you won't have engaged in a holistic evaluation of what it is you're doing. So anyway, just to say, Stephen, wonderful comment, and thanks for that. Really, I appreciate it.
Well, when Thad and I first talked, and we talked about an ecosystem. And so this is a large part of what we have been describing, and each of you from your points in the and even the subset of those systems within the systems, and the importance of people like us and our colleagues talking in that respect and acknowledging. I'm interested to participate in the survey and to learn from what you learn and to contribute to it. I think everybody here looks pretty engaged. They've hung in and been attentive. So, and if you haven't, if you've looked at the field guide that was sent with your invitation or forwarded, it has the link in it to join the survey so that you can sign up directly from there. And then Thad and I will work to send it out to our members, to our friends in our email, and we'll also share it on ATS Engage. So we'll help spread the word.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I've just put in the chat a link to the website where you'll find all kinds of information about our particular effort. And so we are very interested in being in continued conversation to learn from you. I want you to know we've taken a big risk with this particular project because not only is it expansive and is it kind of this wild beast that we're trying to understand and tame and lure in, but also we're doing it on a bootstrapped budget. The survey is long. I mean, like all the things that they tell you that you should not do is basically what we have done in terms of survey methodology. But the reason we've done it this way is because we have an underlying belief that the folks that are like you, that care for clergy, care about this in a big way. So there's no compensation for the survey. The survey is long. I mean, it's not too long, but it's, it's on the longer end. And yet we're willing to move forward because we believe that there are people who believe in this work. We know that you are part of that constellation. We know that continuing education matters. And so I just want to affirm the work of Alam. Specifically, Sarah, thank you for your leadership. And we are so excited to partner together in this particular effort.
Are there any closing questions or comments? As I told Thad, we don't have to go up to 5 o'clock. Ending early is always a good option. All of us who are in lifelong learning know our participants appreciate that. Well then.
Well, I'll just end by saying thank you so much to all of you for your ministry, for your work, for the weary days that you have trogged forward during the pandemic, for all the hours that you invest in caring for those that are serving the people of God and the work that you do in advancing the kingdom of God here on earth. Thank you so much for your work. And again, we look forward to partnering with you.